Um, in 1981, I made a record by myself, and there was a collective in Chicago, a group of other punk bands in Chicago that started a collective record label called Ruthless Records. That the way that label operated was that every band was responsible for making and manufacturing their own records, but we would sell them through a shared post office box that we used as an official address. And they would all say Ruthless Records on them, and we would do sort of centralized selling and collecting from the distributors. And more often than not, that fell to me. There was another guy named John Babin who was the manager, sort of manager, fifth member of a band called the Effigies. He and I did the lion's share of the sales and collection for the label. And the idea there was that if you're just an individual band and you manage to convince a distributor to take some of your records, they had no incentive to pay you. That's one band of the thousands of bands that they'll be whose records they'll be selling. And unless you had another release that they wanted, they had no incentive to pay you. But for example, the band I was in was called Big Black, and it was our first record. We were unknown. The Effigies and Naked Ray Gun, who were also parts of the collective, like they were more well known than us. So if there was an Effigies release coming or a Naked Ray Gun release coming, and they hadn't paid the bill for the Big Black records, I could say with a straight face, hey, you're not in good standing with this label. I don't know if we want to sell you any of these records until you make good on this other invoice. And then that would sort of force their hand, and they'd have to shit or get off the pot and either ship us the records back and we could sell them to somebody else, or pay their invoice. That was the operating principle, was that we would use each other as leverage to get paid for our individual records. In every sense, we were all operating independently. Like we were all making our own records, spending our own money, manufacturing our own records, doing what we wanted in terms of the content. The collective part of it was just the administration of selling and collecting. It was a bullshit move. Now later, after Naked Ray Gun and the Effigies, and there was another band called Circle 7, after they all sort of signed with more established labels, or they had other people putting their records out, then the name Ruthless Records survived, and the post office box survived, and I tried to run it independently. I tried to run it by myself as a proper record label, where I give bands money to go into the studio, and they would record, and then I would press up the records and sell them. And I did probably a half a dozen records that way. I was terrible at it. I had a distribution deal with a pressing and distribution deal with a label called Dutch East India Trading, and they later became notorious as a label that was, delinquent on paying people and very not transparent about what was going on with records. And that distributor ended up becoming quite disreputable. And I was very lucky that I didn't have too much tied up with them. And by the time our relationship ended, they just wanted to be done with me. So they just shipped me all of the remaining inventory and said, basta. So I was able to give all of those records to the individual bands. There was a band called End Result. There was a band called Rifle Sport from Minneapolis, a band called Dark Arts from Columbus, Ohio, the Appliances SFB from Madison, Wisconsin. And so basically we just got the inventory back for all those records, and I gave that inventory to these other bands, and then they got to sell them and keep the money. Kind of an okay way for it to work out. We didn't have any money. Like if a band wanted to make a record, they would get their money together and then go into the studio and make a record, and then the label identity, Ruthless, would just be the administration of selling and collecting. I had a job like a regular person. Yep. I mean, that was true for literally everybody involved in music and in the underground at that point. Like everybody had a job. Nobody thought making records or being in a band was a career. It was all something that we were all sort of driven to do. And in order to support it, you would end up having to have a job and working to support your participation in music in exactly the same way that you would need a job to support a family. Like, it was exactly the same. If I'm going to be responsible and do this music thing in a way that doesn't burden other people, I have to earn enough money to make sure that it can pay for itself. And all of those bands operated that way. Like, I can't think of a single person in the scene that was active in music that didn't have a straight job. I mean, every now and again there would be a scenario where somebody would have a bunch of money, like somebody would inherit some money, or then somebody would be like, I'll underwrite this record, like, or just some unfathomably wealthy person would want to sort of dabble in being a record entrepreneur. And that would happen every now and again, but that certainly wasn't a reliable, like, you couldn't count on that as being how you were going to do things. As a musician, never. Living as a musician, it would literally never happen. Yeah, well, I built a studio in the basement of the house that I bought. The background for all this is that I had a straight job, and my straight job paid me a salary that was reliable. And then, so, I had reasonable credit because I'd never borrowed any money, and I had a reasonable income, so I could go to the bank and get a mortgage and buy a house. And that's that's a feature of having steady employment, is that you can participate in that kind of a system where you borrow money and buy a house.
Sure.
So then I built a studio in the basement of that house, a semi-professional, just home studio. And then my band recorded there, and then I started making it available to my friends' bands. And that's how I developed a lot of my working methods, and all of my friends' bands, would turn their friends on to this. Hey, this guy Steve, he can record your band in the basement of his house. So then I started getting some word of mouth business that way. And eventually I started charging for my time as an engineer. I think when I started getting calls from people that I had never met before, okay, where, like, all my friends' bands, I would work on their records for free. And then I started getting calls from people who were friends of friends, or people who were like distant associates of friends. And for those people, like, I knew that my studio wasn't fantastic. Yeah, it was a very modest studio, and so I didn't feel comfortable charging a lot of money for the studio. Sure. And I just tried to figure out what's a reasonable amount to pay one of my peers. Like, if a guy was going to spend a day doing something for me, whether it was like, siding my house, or doing sound at a gig, or like what's a reasonable daily rate for something like that? Just some like simple manual labor, or some simple task that you're going to do. And so I started charging $100 a day for myself. And that seemed, at the time, this would have been late 80s, that seemed like a perfectly reasonable amount of money to make. That would annualize to about $20-something thousand a year if I were to do it every day. But it was still a very part-time endeavor. It was still like evenings and weekends. And I didn't quit my job and go full-time as an engineer until I had about 3 months worth of work on the calendar and about 3 months worth of expenses saved up in the bank. So I had about 3 months worth of my mortgage payment and utility bills in the bank, and I had about 3 months worth of work lined up. So I figured, if I shoot through my savings and I collect on all the money that I'm going to earn in the meantime, that sort of puts me ahead to a total of about 6 months of life. So I could reassess, and if I make it, I would just try to get my job back.